Section 4 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Judy Derby. The Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1 by Arthur Griffiths. Section 4. Newgate in the 16th Century. The prison records of the 16th century are very meagre. No elaborate system of incarceration as we understand it existed. The only idea of punishment was the infliction of physical pain. The penalties inflicted were purely personal, and so to speak final, such as chastisement, degradation, or death. England had no galleys, no scheme of enforced labor at the oar, such as was known to the nations of the Mediterranean seaboard, no method of compelling perpetual toil in quarry or mine. The germ of transportation, no doubt, was to be found in the practice which suffered offenders who had taken sanctuary to escape punishment by voluntary exile. But it was long before the plan of deporting criminals beyond seas became the rule. In Henry VIII's time, says Froude, there was but one step to the gallows from the lash and the branding iron. Criminals did not always get their deserts, however. Although historians have gravely asserted that 72,000 executions took place in this single reign, the statement will not bear examination, and has been utterly demolished by Froude. As a matter of fact, offenders far too often escaped scot-free through the multiplication of sanctuaries, which refuges, like that of St. Martin's-le-Grand, existed under the very walls of Newgate, the negligence of pursuers, and not seldom the stout opposition of the inculpated. Benefit of clergy claimed and conceded on the most shadowy grounds was another easy and frequent means of evading the law. Some judges certainly had held that the tonsure was an indispensable proof, but all were not so strict, and putting on the book, in other words, the simple act of reading aloud, was deemed sufficient. So flagrant was the evasion of the law that jailers for a certain fee would assist accused persons to obtain a smattering of letters, whereby they might plead their clergy in court. It may be added that although the abuse of the privilege was presently greatly checked, it was not until the reign of William and Mary that benefit of clergy was absolutely denied to burglars, pickpockets, and other criminal offenders. Yet there were spasmodic intervals of the most extraordinary severity. 20 thieves, says Sir Thomas More in his Utopia, might then be seen hanging on a single gibbet. Special legislation was introduced to deal with special crimes. Although there was an appropriateness in the retribution which overtook him, the sentence inflicted upon the Bishop of Rochester's cook in 1531, under a new act passed for the purpose, was ferociously cruel. This man, one Richard Rose or Rouse, was convicted of having poisoned 16 persons with porridge specially prepared to put an end to his master. The crime had been previously almost unknown in England, and special statutory powers were taken to cope with it. An act was at once passed defining the offence to be high treason, and prescribing boiling to death as the penalty. Rose was accordingly, after conviction, boiled alive in Smithfield. It may be added that this cruel statute, which may be read in extenso in Froude, was soon afterwards repealed, but not before another culprit, Margaret Davy by name, had suffered under its provisions for a similar offence. It is only a passing glimpse that we get of the meaner sort of criminal committed to Newgate in these times. The jail, as I have said, was but the antechamber to something worse. It was the starting point for the painful promenade to the pillory. The jurors who were forsworn for rewards or favour of parties were judged to ride from Newgate to the pillory in Cornhill with paper mitres on their heads, there to stand, and from thence again to Newgate. Again, the ringleaders of false inquests, Darby, Smith, and Simpson by name, were, in the first year of Henry VII's reign, 1509, condemned to ride about the city with their faces to their horses' tails, and paper on their heads, and were set on the pillory at Cornhill. After that they were brought back to Newgate, where they died for very shame. A few extracts will serve further to describe the criminal inmates of Newgate in those times. The quotations are from the Remembrancia, 1579 to 1664. Searches appear to have been regularly made for suspected persons, who, when caught, were committed to ward. Thus, 1519, a search was made in the house of William Solcock in Holborn, and it was found that one Christopher Tillesley had lain there 2 nights. He has no master, and is committed to Newgate. Again, in the house of Christopher Arundel, one Robert Bailey has no master, and is committed to Newgate. To Newgate were also committed any who were bold enough to malign the great Cardinal Wolsey, in the plenitude of his power, as was Adam Green in June 1523, a prisoner in Ludgate, who repeated to the keeper what he had heard from a butcher, to the effect that Wolsey had told the king that all London were traitors to his grace. Green was warned to keep silent, but he said he would abide by it, for he had it from a substantial man who would also abide by it. Instances of more serious crimes are recorded. In March 1528, Stephen reports to Thomas Cromwell that between the hours of 6 and 7, 5 thieves knocked at the door of Roderigo the Spaniard, which dwelleth next the goldsmith, against your door. Being asked who was there, they answered, one from the court, to speak with Roderigo. When the door was opened, 3 of them rushed in and found the said Roderigo sitting by the fire, with a poor woman dwelling next to Miss Windsor. 2 tarried and kept the door, and strangled the poor woman that she should not cry. They then took Roderigo's purse, and killed him by stabbing him in the belly, but had not fled far before 2 of them were taken and brought to Newgate. Debtors were too small fry to be often referred to in the chronicles of the times. Now and again they are mentioned as fitting objects for charity, royal and private. In the King's Book of Payments is the following entry, under date May 1515. Master Almoner redeeming prisoners in Newgate, Ludgate, and the Compter, £20. The State Papers, 1581, contain a commission to the Lord Mayor, Recorder, and Sheriffs of London, and many others, all charitable folk, and some 60 in numbers, to compound with the creditors of poor debtors, at that time prisoners in Newgate, Ludgate, and the 2 Compters of the city. Although debtors in jail who volunteered for service on shipboard were discharged by proclamation from the demands of their creditors, as a general rule, committal to Newgate on account of monetary mismanagement appears to have been more easily compassed than subsequent release. The same volume of State Papers contains a petition from Richard Case to Lord Burleigh, to the effect that he had been committed to Newgate upon the unjust complaint of Mr. Benedict Spinola, relative to the lease of certain lands and tenements in London. The petitioner further desires to be discharged from prison, and to have the Queen's pardon. But there is no allusion to his enlargement. The impolicy of confining debtors was not to be fully realized till 3 more centuries had passed away. But as early as 1700, a pamphlet preserved in the Harleian Miscellany and entitled Labor in Vain, anticipates modern feeling and modern legislation. The writer protests against the imprisonment of debtors, which he compares to shutting up a cow from herbage when she gives no milk. In England we confine people to starve, contrary to humanity, mercy, or policy. One may as reasonably expect his dog, he says, when chained to a post should catch a hare, as that poor debtors when in jail should get wherewithal to pay their debts. Details of the incarceration and sufferings of prisoners for conscience' sake, in an age when polemics were backed up by the strong arm of the law, are naturally to be met with more frequently in the partisan writings of the time. Throughout the reigns of Henry VIII, Mary, and even in that of Elizabeth, intolerance stalked rampant through the land, filling the prisons and keeping Smithfield in a blaze. Henry was by turns severe on all creeds. Now Protestants, now Catholics suffered. He began as an ardent champion of Romish doctrines, and ended by denying the supremacy of the Pope. In the first stage he persecuted so-called heretics. In the second he despoiled church property, and sent monks and priors to jail and to the gallows. Fox gives a long and detailed list of the Protestant martyrs from first to last. One of the most prominent was Richard Bayfield, a monk of Bury, who became an inmate of Newgate. Fox relates that a letter of inquiry was issued by the Bishop of London to the Lord Mayor and sheriffs to be present at St. Paul's on the 20th November 1531, to receive the said Richard Bayfield, alias Soundesam, a relapsed heretic after sentence. The sheriffs carried him to Newgate, whence they were commanded again to bring him into Paul's upper choir, there to give attendance upon the bishop. Later on they are ordered to have him into the vestry, and then to bring him forth again in Antichrist's apparel to be degraded before them. When the bishop had degraded him, says old Fox, kneeling upon the highest step of the altar, he took his crosier's staff and smote him on the breast. Then he threw him down backwards and brake his head, so that he swooned. And when he came to himself again, he was led forth through the choir to Newgate, and there rested about an hour in prayer, and so went to the fire in his apparel manfully and joyfully, and there for lack of a speedy fire was 2/4 of an hour alive. Henry was, however, impartial in his severity. In 1533 he suffered John Frith, Andrew Hewitt, and other Protestants, to the number of 27, to be burned for heresy. The years immediately following he hunted to death all who refused to acknowledge him as the head of the Church. Besides such imposing victims as Sir Thomas More and Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, many priests suffered. In 1534 the prior of the London Carthusians, the prior of Hexham, Benace, a monk of Sion College, and John Haight, vicar of Isleworth, together with others, were sentenced to be hanged and quartered at Tyburn. In 1538 a friar, by name Forrest, was hanged in Smithfield upon a gallows, quick, by the middle and the armholes, and burned to death for denying the king's supremacy, and teaching the same in confession to many of the king's subjects. Upon the pile by which Forrest was consumed was also a wooden image brought out of Wales, called Darvel Gatherin, which the Welshmen much worshipped, and had a prophecy amongst them that this image would set a whole forest on fire, which prophecy took effect. The greatest trials were reserved for the religious dissidents who dared to differ with the king. Henry was vain of his learning and of his polemical powers. No true follower of Luther, he was a Protestant by policy rather than conviction, and he still held many tenets of the Church he had disavowed. These were embodied and promulgated in the notorious 6 Articles, otherwise the whip with 6 tails, or the bloody statute, so called from its sanguinary results. The doctrines enunciated were such that many could not possibly subscribe to them. The penalties were straight and bloody, and very soon they were widely inflicted. Fox, in a dozen or more pages, recounts the various presentments against individuals, lay and clerical, for transgressing one or more of the principles of the 6 Articles, and adds to the aforesaid, Dr. Taylor, parson of St. Peter's in Cornhill, South, parish priest of All Hallows in Lombard Street, Some, a priest, Giles, the king's beer brewer at the Red Lion in St. Catherine's, Thomas Lancaster, priest, all which were imprisoned likewise for the 6 Articles. To be short, he adds, such a number out of all parishes in London and out of Calais, and divers other quarters, were then apprehended through the said Inquisition, that all prisons in London, including Newgate, were too little to hold them, insomuch that they were fain to lay them in the halls. At last, by the means of good Lord Audeley, such pardon was obtained of the king, that the said Lord Audeley, then Lord Chancellor, being content that one should be bound for another, they were all discharged, being bound only to appear in the Star Chamber the next day after All Souls, there to answer if they were called, but neither was there any person called, neither did any appear. Bonner, then Bishop of London, and afterwards one of the Queen's principal advisers, had power to persecute even under Henry. The Bible had been set up by the king's command in St. Paul's, that the public might read the sacred word. Much people used to resort thither, says Fox, to hear the reading of the Bible, and especially by one John Porter, a fresh young man, and of a big stature, who was very expert. It displeased Bonner that this Porter should draw such congregations, and sending for him, the bishop rebuked him very sharply for his reading. Porter defended himself, but Bonner charged him with adding expositions of the text, and gathering great multitudes about him to make tumults. Nothing was proved against Porter, but, in fine, Bonner sent him to Newgate, where he was miserably fettered in irons, both legs and arms, with a collar of iron about his neck, fastened to the wall in the dungeon, being there so cruelly handled that he was compelled to send for a kinsman of his, whose name is also Porter, a man yet alive, and can testify that it is true, and dwelleth yet without Newgate. He, seeing his kinsman in this miserable case, entreated Jewett, the keeper of Newgate, that he might be released out of those cruel irons, and so, through friendship and money, had him up among other prisoners, who lay there for felony and murder. Porter made the most of the occasion, and after hearing and seeing their wickedness and blasphemy, exhorted them to amendment of life, and gave unto them such instructions as he had learned of in the Scriptures, for which his so doing he was complained, and so carried down and laid in the lower dungeon of all, oppressed with bolts and irons, where, within 6 or 8 days, he was found dead. But the most prominent victim to the 6 Articles was Anne Askew, the daughter of Sir William Askew, Knight of Lincolnshire. She was married to one Kyme, but is best known under her maiden name. She was persecuted for denying the real presence, but the proceedings against her were pushed to extremity, it was said, because she was befriended in high quarters. Her story is a melancholy one. First, one Christopher Dean examined her as to her faith and belief in a very subtle manner, and upon her answers had her before the Lord Mayor, who committed her to the Compter. There, for 11 days, none but a priest was allowed to visit her, his object being to ensnare her further. Presently she was released upon finding sureties to surrender if required, but was again brought before the King's Council at Greenwich. Her opinions in matters of belief proving unsatisfactory, she was remanded to Newgate. Thence she petitioned the King, also the Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, to aid her in obtaining just consideration. Nevertheless she was taken to the Tower, and there tortured. Fox puts the following words into her mouth. On Tuesday I was sent from Newgate to the Sign of the Crown, where Master Rich and the Bishop of London, with all their power and flattering words, went about to persuade me from God, but I did not esteem their glozing pretences. Then Master Rich sent me to the Tower, where I remained till 3 o'clock. At the Tower, strenuous efforts were made to get her to accuse others. They pressed her to say how she was maintained in prison, whether divers gentlewomen had not sent her money. But she replied that her maid had gone abroad in the streets and made moan to the prentices who had sent her alms. When further urged, she admitted that a man in a blue coat had delivered her 10 shillings, saying it came from my Lady Hertford, and that another in a violet coat had given her 8 shillings from my Lady Denny. Whether it is true or not, I cannot tell. Then they said 3 men of the council did maintain me, and I said no. Then they did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlemen to be of my opinion, and thereon they kept me a long time. And because I lay still and did not cry, my Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands till I was nigh dead. Then the lieutenant, Sir Anthony Knevet, caused me to be loosed from the rack. Incontinently I swooned, and then they recovered me again. After that I sat 2 long hours, reasoning with my Lord Chancellor on the bare floor. At last she was brought to a house and laid in a bed with as weary and painful bones as ever had patient Job. I thank my Lord God therefore. Then my Lord Chancellor sent me word, if I would leave my opinion, I should want nothing. If I did not, I should forthwith to Newgate, and so be burned. Fox gives full details of her torture in the Tower. At first she was let down into a dungeon, and the jailer, by command of Sir Anthony Knevet, pinched her with the rack. After this, deeming he had done enough, he was about to take her down, but Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, commanded the lieutenant to strain her on the rack again, which, because he denied to do, tendering the weakness of the woman, he was threatened therefore grievously of the said Wriothesley, saying he would signify his disobedience to the king. And so consequently upon the same, he, Wriothesley, and Master Rich, throwing off their gowns, would needs play the tormentors themselves. And so, quietly and patiently praying unto the Lord, she abode their tyranny till her bones and joints were almost plucked asunder, in such sort as she was carried away in a chair. Then the Chancellor galloped off to report the lieutenant to the king, but Sir Anthony Knevet forestalled by going by water, and obtained the king's pardon before the complaint was made. King Henry, says Fox, seemed not very well to like of their so extreme handling of the woman. Soon after, this Mistress Askew was again committed to Newgate, whence she was carried in a chair to Smithfield, because she could not walk on her feet by means of her great torments. When called upon to recant, she refused, as did the martyrs with her, whereupon the Lord Mayor, commanding fire to be put under them, cried, Fiat Justitia, and they were burned. The Marian persecutions naturally filled Newgate. It would weary the reader to give lengthened descriptions of the many martyrs who passed through that prison to Smithfield. but a few of the victims stand prominently forward. Two of the earliest were John Rogers, vicar of St. Sepulchre, and prebendary of St. Paul's, and Hooper, Bishop of Gloucester. Rogers was the proto-martyr, the first sacrificed to the religious intolerance of Mary and her advisers. Fox says that after being a prisoner in his own house for a long time, Rogers was removed to the prison called Newgate, where he was lodged among thieves and murderers for a great space. He was kept in Newgate a full year, Rogers tells us himself, at great costs and charges, having a wife and 10 children to find for, and I had never a penny of my livings, which was against the law. He made many supplications out of Newgate, and sent his wife to implore fairer treatment. But in Newgate he lay, till at length he was brought to the Compter in Southwark, with Master Hooper, for examination. Finally, after having been very uncharitably entreated, he was unjustly and most cruelly by wicked Winchester condemned. The 4th February 1555, he was warned suddenly by the keeper's wife of Newgate to prepare himself for the fire, who being then found asleep, scarce with much shogging could be awakened. Being bidden to make haste, he remarked, "If it be so, I need not tie my points." So was he had down first to Bonner to be degraded, whom he petitioned to be allowed to talk a few words with his wife before his burning, a reasonable request, which was refused. Then the sheriffs, Master Chester and Master Woodroove, took him to Smithfield, and his wife and children, 11 in number, 10 able to go, and 1 at the breast, met him as he passed. This sorrowful sight of his own flesh and blood could nothing move him, but that he constantly and cheerfully took his death with wonderful patience in the defence and quarrel of Christ's gospel. While detained in Newgate, Master Rogers devoted himself to the service of the ordinary prisoners, to whom he was beneficial and liberal, having thus devised that he with his fellows should have but 1 meal a day, they paying notwithstanding the charges of the whole. The other meal should be given to them that lacked on the other, or common, side of the prison. But Alexander their keeper, a straight man and a right Alexander, a coppersmith, indeed, would in no case suffer that. This Alexander Andrew, or Alexander as he is simply called, figures in contemporary records, more especially in the writings of Fox, as a perfect type of the brutal jailer. Of jailers, says Fox, Alexander, keeper of Newgate, exceeded all others. He is described as a cruel enemy of those that lay there, Newgate, for religion. The cruel wretch, to hasten the poor lambs to the slaughter, would go to Bonner, Story, Cholmley, and others, crying out, "Rid my prison! Rid my prison! I am too much pestered by these heretics." Alexander's reception of an old friend of his, Master Philpot, when committed to Newgate, is graphically told by the old chronicler. "Ah, thou hast well done to bring thyself hither," he says to Philpot. "I must be content," replied Philpot, "for it is God's appointment, and I shall desire you to let me have some gentle favour, for you and I have been of old acquaintance." "Well," said Alexander, "I will show thee great gentleness and favour, so thou wilt be ruled by me." Then said Master Philpot, "I pray you show me what you would have me to do." He said, "If you will recant, I will show you any pleasure I can." "Nay," said Master Philpot, "I will never recant whilst I have my life, for it is most certain truth, and in witness thereof I will seal it with my blood." Then Alexander said, "This is the saying of the whole pack of you heretics." Whereupon he commanded him to be set upon the block, and as many irons upon his legs as he could bear, for that he would not follow his wicked mind. "But, good Master Alexander, be so much my friend that these irons may be taken off." "Well," said Alexander, Give me my fees, and I will take them off. If not, thou shalt wear them still." Then Master Philpot said, "Sir, what is your fee?" He said £4 was his fee. "Ah," said Master Philpot, "I have not so much. I am but a poor man, and I have been long in prison." "What wilt thou give me then?" said Alexander. "Sir," said he, "I will give you 20 shillings, and that I will send my man for, or else I will lay my gown to gauge. For the time is not long, I am sure, that I shall be with you, for the bishop said I should be soon dispatched." Then said Alexander unto him, "What is that to me?" And with that he departed for a time, and commanded him to be had into limbo. And so his commandment was fulfilled, but before he could be taken from the block, the clerk would have a groat. Then one Willerence, steward of the house, took him on his back and carried him down his man knew not whither. Wherefore Master Philpot said to his man, "Go to Master Sheriff, and show him how I am used, and desire Master Sheriff to be good unto me." And so his servant went straightway, and took an honest man with him. And when they came to Master Sheriff, which was Master Ascham, and showed him how Master Philpot was handled in Newgate, the sheriff, hearing this, took his ring off his finger, and delivered it unto that honest man that comes with Master Philpot's man, and bade him go unto Alexander the keeper, and command him to take off his irons, and handle him more gently, and give his man again that which he had taken from him. And when they came to the said Alexander, and told their message from the sheriff, Alexander took the ring and said, "Ah, I perceive that Master Sheriff is a bearer with him, and all such heretics as he is. Therefore tomorrow I will show it to his betters." Yet at 10 by the clock he went to Master Philpot where he lay, and took off his irons, and gave him such things as he had taken before from his servant. Alexander's zeal must have been very active. In 1558 it is recorded that 22 men and women were committed to Newgate for praying together in the fields about Islington. They were 22 weeks in the prison before they were examined, during which Alexander sent them word that if they would hear a mass they should be delivered. According to Fox, a terrible vengeance overtook this hard-hearted man. He died very miserably, being so swollen that he was more like a monster than a man. The same authority relates that other persecutors came to a bad end. Bishop Hooper soon followed Rogers to the stake. The same Monday night, February 4th, 1555, the keeper of Newgate gave him an inkling that he should be sent to Gloucester to suffer death, and the next day following, about 4 o'clock in the morning before day, the keeper with others came to him and searched him and the bed wherein he lay to see if he had written anything. And then he was led to the sheriffs of London and other their officers forth of Newgate, to a place appointed not far from Dunstan's Church, Fleet Street, where 6 of the Queen's guards were appointed to receive him and to carry him to Gloucester, where execution was to be done. We obtain a curious insight into the jail at Newgate during Mary's reign from the narrative of the Hot Gospeller. Edward Underhill, a yeoman of the guard, was arrested in 1553 for putting out a ballad which attacked the Queen's title. Underhill was carried before the council, and there got into dispute with Bourne, a fanatic priest whom he called a papist. Sir John Mason asked what he meant by that, and he replied, "If you look among the priests of Paul's, you will find some Mompsimuses there." This caused much heat, and he was committed to Newgate. At the door of the prison he wrote to his wife, asking her to send his nightgown, Bible, and lute, and then he goes on to describe Newgate as follows. In the centre of Newgate was a great open hall. As soon as it was supper time, the board was covered in the same hall. The keeper, whose name was Alexander, with his wife came and sat down, and 6 prisoners that were there for felony, Underhill being the first that for religion was sent into that prison. One of the felons had served with him in France. After supper this good fellow, whose name was Bristow, procured one to have a bed in his (Underhill's) chamber, who could play well upon a rebeck. He was a tall fellow, and after one of Queen Mary's guard, yet a Protestant, which he kept secret, or else he should not have found such favour as he did at the keeper's hands and his wife's, for to such as loved the gospel they were very cruel. "Well," said Underhill, "I have sent for my Bible, and by God's grace therein shall be my daily exercise. I will not hide it from them." "Sir," said he, "I am poor, but they will bear with you, for they see your estate is to pay well, and I will show you the nature and manner of them, for I have been here a good while. They both do love music very well, wherefore you with your lute, and I to play with you on my rebeck, will please them greatly. He loveth to be merry and to drink wine, and she also. If you will bestow upon them, every dinner and supper, a quart of wine and some music, you shall be their white son, and have all the favour they can show you." The honour of being white son to the governor and governess of Newgate was worth aspiring after, as it meant many privileges and much favour. Underhill duly provided the desired entertainment. The governor gave him the best room in the prison, with all other admissible indulgences. At last, however, the evil savours great unquietness, with over many draughts of air, threw the poor gentleman into a burning ague. He shifted his lodgings, but to no purpose. The evil savours followed him. The keeper offered him his own parlour, where he escaped from the noise of the prison, but it was near the kitchen, and the smell of the meat was disagreeable. Finally the wife put him away in her store-closet, amidst her best plate, crockery, and clothes, and there he continued to survive till the middle of September, when he was released on bail through the interference of the Earl of Bedford. There was a truce to religious persecution for some years after Mary's death. Throughout Edward's reign and the better part of Elizabeth's, it was only the ordinary sort of criminal who was committed to the jail of Newgate. The offences were mostly coining, horse-stealing, and other kinds of thefts. One named Ditch was apprehended at the session holden at Newgate on 4th December 1583, 19 times indicted, whereof he confessed 18, who also between the time of his apprehension and the said sessions impeached many for stealing horses, whereof, divers being apprehended, 10 were condemned and hanged in Smithfield on the 11th December, being Friday, and horse market there. The Remembrancia gives a letter from Mr. Valentine Dale, one of the masters of the Court of Requests, to the Lord Mayor, stating that the wife of John Hollingshead had petitioned the Queen to grant a reprieve and pardon to her husband, a condemned felon, and directing the execution to be stayed, and a full account of his behaviour and offence forwarded to her Majesty. The Lord Mayor in reply says that he had called before him the officers of Newgate, who stated that Hollingshead had been for a long time a common and notorious thief. This was the 4th time he had been in Newgate for felonies, and upon the last occasion he had been branded with the letter T, thief. Coiners were very severely dealt with. The offence was treason, and punished as such. There are many cases on record, such as: on the 27th of January, Philip Michel, a Frenchman, and 2 Englishmen were drawn from Newgate to Tyburn, and there hanged. The Frenchman quartered, who had coined gold counterfeit. Of the Englishmen, the one had clipped silver, and the other cast testers of tin. The 30th of May, Thomas Green, goldsmith, was drawn from Newgate to Tyburn, and there hanged, beheaded, and quartered for clipping of coin, both gold and silver. Towards the end of the reign, in spite of the stringent acts against vagrancy, the country swarmed with rogues and beggars, vagabonds who laid the farmers under contribution, and terrified all honest folk out of their lives. In London, crime was rampant. Even then it had its organization. There were houses which harboured thieves, in which schools were maintained for the education of young pickpockets. Maitland tells us that in the spring of 1585, Fleetwood, the recorder, with several other magistrates, searched the town and discovered 7 houses of entertainment of felons. They found also that one Walton, a gentleman born, once a prosperous merchant, but fallen into decay, who had kept an alehouse which had been put down, had begun a new business. He opened his house for the reception of all the cut-purses in and about the city. In this house was a room to teach young boys to cut purses. 2 devices were hung up. One was a pocket, the other was a purse. The pocket had in it certain counters, and was hung round with hawk's bells, and over them hung a little sacring bell. The purse had silver in it, and he that could take out a counter without any noise was allowed to be a public foister, and he that could take a piece of silver out of the purse without noise of any of the bells was adjudged a clever nipper. These places gave great encouragement to evildoers in these times, but were soon after suppressed. In 1581 a fresh religious persecution began, happily without the sanguinary accessories of that of Mary's reign. Elizabeth had no love for the Puritans. She also began now to hate and fear the Papists. Orthodoxy was insisted upon. People who would not go to church were sent first to prison, then haled before sessions, and fined a matter of £20 each. Still worse fared the adherents or emissaries of Rome. In 1569 a man named John Felton had been drawn from Newgate into Paul's churchyard, and there hanged and quartered as a traitor for affixing a bull of Pope Pius V on the gate of the Bishop of London's palace. In 1578 it is recorded that the Papists are stubborn. So also must have been the Puritans. One Sherwood, brought before the Bishop of London, behaved so stubbornly that the bishop will show no more favour to those miscalled Puritans. Next began a fierce crusade against the seminary priests, who swarmed into England like missionaries, dispatched in partibus infidelium to minister to the faithful few, and bring back all whom they could to the fold. Newgate was now for ever full of these priests. They adopted all manner of disguises, and went now as soldiers, now as private gentlemen, now openly as divines. They were harboured and hidden by faithful Roman Catholics, and managed thus to glide unperceived from point to point, intent upon their dangerous business. But they did not always escape observation, and when caught they were invariably laid by the heels and hardly dealt with. Gerard Dance, alias Ducat, a seminary priest, was arraigned in 1581 at the Old Bailey before the Queen's justices, and affirmed that although he was in England, he was subject to the Pope in ecclesiastical causes, and that the Pope had now the same authority in England as he had 100 years ago, in which he exercised at Rome, with other traitorous speeches, for which he was condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The same year William Dios, a Spaniard, keeper of Newgate, sent a certificate of the names of the recusants now in Newgate, viz., Lawrence Wakeman and others, the 2 last being of the precise sort. April 20, 1586, Robert Raleigh, taken upon seas by Captain Burrows going to Scotland, is committed first to the Marshalsea, and from thence to Newgate. Next year, August 26th, Richard Young reports to Secretary Walsingham that he has talked with sundry priests remaining in the prisons about London. Some, he says, are very evil affected, and unworthy to live in England. Simpson, alias Haygate, and Flower, priests, have justly deserved death, and in no wise merit Her Majesty's mercy. William Wiggs, Leonard Hyde, and George Collinson, priests in Newgate, are dangerous fellows, as are also Morris Williams and Thomas Pound, the latter committed as a layman, but in reality a professed Jesuit. Francis Tyrrell is an obstinate papist, and is doubted to be a spy. We read as follows in an intercepted letter from Cardinal John Allen, rector of the English College at Rheims, to Mr. White, seminary priest in the Clink prison, and the rest of the priests in Newgate, the Fleet, and the Marshalsea. Pope Sextus sends them his blessing, and will send them over, for their comfort, Dr. Reynolds, chief Jesuit of the college at Rheims, who must be carefully concealed, with others, whose discourses would be a great joy to all heretics. They will bring some consecrated crucifixes, late consecrated by His Holiness, and some books to be given to the chiefest Catholics, their greatest benefactors. This letter was taken upon a young man, Robert Weston, travelling to seek service, who seems to have had considerable dealings with recusants, and to have made very full confessions. It was easier for all such to get into Newgate at that time than to obtain release. Henry Ashe and Michael Jennison, being prisoners in Newgate, petitioned Lord Keeper Pickering for a warrant for their enlargement upon putting in good security for their appearance. They were long since committed by Justice Young and the now Bishop of London for recusancy, where they remain, to their great shame and utter undoing, and are likely to continue, unless he extend his mercy. In 1598, George Barkworth petitions Secretary Cecil that he was committed to Newgate 6 months ago on suspicion of being a seminary priest, which he is not, has been examined 9 times, and brought up at sessions 4 times, begs the same liberty of the house at Bridewell, which was granted him at Newgate. Political prisoners were not wanting in Newgate in the Elizabethan period. In 1585 instructions are given to the recorder to examine one Hall, a prisoner in Newgate, charged with the design for conveying away the Queen of Scots. This was a part of Babington's conspiracy, for which Throgmorton also suffered. Other victims, besides the unfortunate Queen herself, were Babington, Tichborne, and many more, who after trial at the Old Bailey and incarceration in Newgate, were hanged in St. Giles' Fields. The execution was carried out with great barbarity. 7 of the conspirators were cut down before they were dead and disembowelled. Another plot against Elizabeth's life was discovered in 1587, the actors in which were one Moody, an idle, profligate fellow, then prisoner in Newgate, and one Stafford, brother to Sir Edward Stafford. The great Queen Bess, in these last days of her reign, went in constant terror of her life, and a third conspiracy to poison her, originating with her own physician and Lopez, a Jew, led to their execution as traitors. Again, Squires, a disbanded soldier, was charged with putting poison on the pommel of her saddle, and although he admitted his guilt upon the rack, he declared when dying that he was really innocent. All this time within Newgate there was turbulence, rioting, disorders, accompanied seemingly by constant oppression. The prisoners were ready to brave anything to get out. General jail deliveries were made otherwise than in due course of law. Those that were fit to serve in the sea or land forces were frequently pardoned and set free. A petition to the Lord Admiral, 1589, is preserved, in which certain prisoners, shut out from pardon because they are not by law bailable, beg that the words may be struck out of the order for release, and state that they will gladly enter Her Majesty's service. Many made determined efforts to escape. the 16th December, 1556, says Holinshed, Gregory, carpenter and smith, and a Frenchman born, were arraigned for making counterfeit keys wherewith to have opened the locks of Newgate, to have slain the keeper and let forth the prisoners, at which time of his arraignment, having conveyed a knife into his sleeve, he thrust it into the side of William Whiteguts, his fellow prisoner, who had given evidence against him, so that he was in great peril of death thereby. For the which fact he was immediately taken from the bar into the street before the Justice Hall, when, his hand being first stricken off, he was hanged on a gibbet set up for the purpose. The keeper of Newgate was arraigned and indicted, for that the said prisoner had a weapon about him and his hands loose, which should have been bound. Yet the keeper of Newgate and other jailers were sometimes kept within bounds. 2 cases may be quoted in which these officials were promptly brought to book. In 1555, the keeper of the Bread Street Compter, by name Richard Husband, Pasteler, being a wilful and headstrong man, who with servants like himself had dealt hardly with the prisoners in his charge, was sent to the jail of Newgate by Sir Rowland Hill, mayor, with the assent of a court of aldermen. It was commanded to the keeper to set those irons on his legs which were called widows' alms. These he wore from Thursday till Sunday in the afternoon. On the Tuesday he was released, but not before he was bound over in 100 marks to act in conformity with the rules for the managing of the compters. All which notwithstanding, he continued as before. The prisoners were ill-treated. Prison was made a common lodging-house at 4d. the night for thieves and night-walkers, whereby they might be safe from searches that were made abroad. He was indicted for these and other enormities, but did rub it out, and could not be reformed, till the prisoners were removed, for the house in Bread Street was his own by lease or otherwise, and he could not be put from it. A searching inquiry was also made into the conduct of Crowder, the keeper of Newgate, in 1580 or thereabouts. The state papers contain an information of the disorders practised by the officers of Newgate Prison, levying fines and taking bribes, by old and young Crowders, the jailers. Crowder and his wife, says the report, be most horrible blasphemers and swearers. The matter is taken up by the Lords of the Council, who write to the Lord Mayor, desiring to be fully informed of all disorders committed, and by whom. They are sending gentlemen to repair to the prison to inquire into the case, and requesting the Lord Mayor to appoint 2 persons to assist them. Sir Christopher Hatton also writes to the Lord Mayor, drawing attention to the charges against Crowder. The Lord Mayor replies that certain persons had been appointed to inquire, but had not yet made their report. The Court of Inquiry are willing to receive Crowder, but he persists in refusing to explain. He would not come to their meeting, but stood upon his reputation. The result, so far as can be guessed, was that Crowder was pensioned off, but he found powerful friends in his adversity. His cause was espoused by Sir Thomas Bromley, Lord Chancellor, who informs the Lord Mayor that he thinks Crowder has been dealt with very hardly, and that his accusers were persons unworthy of credit. End of Section 4. Newgate in the 16th Century.